The Tudor era of English history. When we hear those words, our minds often conjure images of dazzling glamour, of immense power, of larger-than-life kings and queens in their magnificent palaces. But this is a carefully constructed fantasy. Here, at Chronicles of Old Tales, we peel back the gilded layers to reveal the truth. Beneath the shimmering surface of the Tudor court, a darker reality festered. This was an age of terrifying paranoia, of consuming fear, and of a ruthless, bottomless ambition that devoured anyone who stood in its way. It was a time when the king's favor was not merely a path to wealth or status. It was the very air you breathed. To lose it meant a swift and often horrifying death. Queens with crowns on their heads were not safe. Brilliant ministers who ran the country were not safe. The highest nobles with bloodlines as old as England itself were not safe. All played this lethal game of thrones where a single misstep, a whispered accusation, or simply being born with the wrong name could lead them to the executioner's block. Yet, among all the state-sanctioned killings that stained the reign of King Henry VIII, one stands out for its sheer, stomach-turning horror. It was a death so profoundly chaotic, so grotesquely unjust, that it has left an indelible, dark blot upon the Tudor dynasty for centuries. It was an execution that even in a brutal age shocked the world. She was 67 years old. Her name was Margaret Pole, the Countess of Salisbury. She was not just a noble, she was one of the very last royals of the magnificent Plantagenet dynasty, the family that had ruled England for over 300 years. And she was condemned to die without a trial, without evidence, based on the vengeful whim of her own cousin, the king. Her private execution, meant to be a quiet affair hidden within the stone walls of the Tower of London, was not the quick or clean end afforded to a woman of her rank. Instead, it descended into a gruesome spectacle of butchery, a scene of bloody mayhem at the hands of a clumsy, terrified, and utterly inexperienced ex-seaman. This is the story of that execution. It is not just a tale of Tudor paranoia, but a deeply personal tragedy, the story of a woman who survived decades of political turmoil only to meet an end so savage it defies belief. This is one of the darkest, most controversial chapters in all of Tudor history. To truly comprehend the unspeakable tragedy of Margaret Pole, you have to understand the blood that flowed through her veins. It was the blood of kings. She wasn't just another noblewoman scrambling for position in the treacherous court of Henry VIII. She was born Margaret Plantagenet, daughter of a royal duke, and the niece of two English kings, Edward IV and the infamous Richard III. Her bloodline was the bloodline of the Lions, a dynasty that had forged England in the fires of war and conquest. In any other era, this would have made her a figure of immense respect and power. But in the dawning age of the Tudors, this legacy was not a blessing, it was a curse. It was a death sentence waiting to be carried out. The Tudor dynasty's grip on the throne was still perilously new, forged in the bloody climax of the Wars of the Roses. The first Tudor king, Henry VII, had won the crown on the battlefield, but his claim was weak, built on a distant and questionable lineage. Anyone with a stronger, more direct claim to the throne was a living, breathing threat to the new regime's survival. And Margaret, as a direct Plantagenet descendant, was a constant, silent reminder of that vulnerability. Her entire life was shaped by this shadow from the very beginning. The specter of traition and execution haunted her family. Her own father, George, Duke of Clarence, was executed for plotting against his own brother, King Edward IV, when Margaret was just a 4-year-old girl. Legend whispers a bizarre and chilling tale of his death, that he was drowned in a butt of his favorite Mounsey wine, a private execution to hide the shame of a king killing his brother. The tragedy didn't end there. Margaret's younger brother, the young Edward, Earl of Warwick, was the last direct male Plantagenet heir. From the age of 10, he was seen as too dangerous to live freely. Henry VII had him locked away in the Tower of London, where he spent most of his life in cold, lonely confinement. His crime was not rebellion or conspiracy. His crime was his existence. After a failed escape attempt, likely orchestrated by the king's own agents, the young earl was finally executed, his death a grim political necessity to secure a royal marriage for Henry VII's son. It was said that the Spanish monarchy demanded his death before they would send their princess, Catherine of Aragon, to marry the Tudor heir, refusing to send her to a kingdom where the succession was still contested. Yet, through all of this bloodshed and fear, Margaret survived. She learned to be quiet, to Helvetica, to be unassuming, to be loyal. Henry VII, in a canny political move, married her off to a loyal, but relatively low-status, Tudor supporter, Sir Richard Pole. The match was deliberately designed to neutralize her, to dilute her royal status and bury her Plantagenet claim under a less threatening name. And it seemed to work. When the charismatic young Henry VIII took the throne, his reign felt like a new dawn. He and his first wife, the same Catherine of Aragon whose marriage had been secured by her brother's blood, seemed to hold genuine affection for Margaret. Henry VIII showered her with favor. In a move of incredible generosity, he restored her family's lands and, in an act of immense respect, made her Countess of Salisbury in her own right a massive, almost unprecedented honor for a woman in the 16th century, making her one of only 2 women to hold a peerage title independently. She was appointed as governess to their beloved daughter, the future Queen Mary I, and became a cherished friend and mother figure to the young princess. For a brief shining moment, it looked as though Margaret Pole had finally outrun the curse of her Plantagenet name. She was a powerful, respected matriarch, a survivor who had found a secure place of honor in the dazzling new Tudor world. She had weathered the storm. But another, far more terrible storm was gathering on the horizon. And this time, the devastating lightning bolt that would bring it all crashing down would be thrown by her own flesh and blood. The beginning of Margaret Pole's catastrophic end came not from the shadowy corridors of the English court, but from across the sea, carried on the ink of her own son's pen. His name was Reginald Pole, and he was Margaret's pride. Brilliant, charismatic, and fiercely devout, Reginald was a star of European scholarship, a man whose education had been generously funded by King Henry himself, who saw him as a jewel of his kingdom. But Reginald's loyalty was not ultimately to his king, but to his God. And when Henry VIII, in his desperate quest for a male heir, resolved to shatter the bedrock of English society by breaking with the Catholic Church to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, Reginald refused to follow. From the relative safety of his studies in Italy, Reginald Pole transformed from a favored scholar into one of the king's most dangerous and outspoken critics. He didn't just disagree, he waged a war of words. He penned a blistering theological treatise, Pro Ecclesiasticae Unitatis Defension, in defense of ecclesiastical unity, which was a direct and savage attack on the king's actions. He didn't just question Henry's supremacy over the church, he called him a tyrant, a heretic, and a schismatic who was dragging his entire kingdom to the brink of damnation. He accused the king of tearing apart the seamless garment of Christ for his own lustful and political desires. For Catholic Europe, Reginald became a hero. The Pope rewarded his defiance by making him a cardinal, a prince of the church, turning him into a living symbol of Catholic resistance against the English Reformation. Back in England, Henry VIII was incandescent with rage. This was not just dissent, this was a profound, personal betrayal from a man he had supported and a family he had elevated. It was treason of the highest order, broadcast for all of Europe to see. The king, a man whose ego was as vast as his kingdom, could not tolerate such an audacious challenge to his authority. He couldn't get his hands on the traitor cardinal protected in Rome, so he vowed to do the next best thing. He would utterly destroy the family that had spawned him. He would make them pay for their son's insolence, one by one. Margaret was horrified. She was trapped in an impossible position, caught between her unshakable loyalty to the king she had served her whole life, and her maternal love for the son whose principles were now threatening to annihilate them all. She wrote desperate letters to Reginald begging him to cease his attacks, pleading with him to understand the mortal danger he was placing them in. But it was far, far too late. The words had been written, the defiance declared. In the increasingly paranoid and terrifying court of Henry VIII, nuance was dead. Guilt was not individual, it was familial. Guilt by association was all that mattered. The entire Pole family, every man, woman, and child, was now irrevocably tainted. Their great Plantagenet name, once a symbol of supreme royalty, was now twisted into a synonym for treason. A slow, creeping, and inescapable dread began to surround Margaret and her children, a feeling of certain doom they were utterly powerless to escape. The king's vengeance was coming for them, and nothing could stop it. In the crisp, ominous autumn of 1538, the axe of the king's vengeance began its terrible, methodical descent. The first to be taken were Margaret's sons, Henry Lord Montague and Geoffrey Pole. They were arrested on charges of treason, accused of being complicit in a conspiracy to overthrow the king and place Cardinal Reginald on the throne. They were dragged to the Tower of London, the very place their great-uncle Edward had been imprisoned and executed, and subjected to the relentless psychological pressures of interrogation. The conditions in the Tower for traitors were notoriously harsh, while high-status prisoners could sometimes live in relative comfort. Those accused of treason faced the constant threat of torture and the crushing weight of isolation. Under this immense strain, Geoffrey, the younger brother, broke. He confessed, and in his desperation, he implicated his entire family, including his own mother, in a web of treasonous correspondence. The case against Margaret herself was almost laughably thin, a grotesque tapestry woven from suspicion and paranoia. The chief architect of her downfall was the king's ruthless minister, Thomas Cromwell, a man who had perfected the art of destroying political enemies. The central piece of evidence Cromwell triumphantly produced against the 65-year-old countess was a simple tunic, supposedly discovered tucked away in one of her homes at Warblington Castle. This garment was embroidered with the symbol of the 5 wounds of Christ. This sacred emblem had recently been adopted by Catholic rebels in the north during a massive uprising against the king's religious reforms, an event known as the Pilgrimage of Grace. The connection was a desperate, malicious stretch. The symbol was a common devotional image, and many historians are convinced the tunic was planted by Cromwell's agents, but in the Kangaroo Court of Tudor England, it was more than enough. In May of 1539, having gathered his flimsy pretext, Cromwell moved for the kill. He used a legal instrument of pure, unadulterated tyranny, the Act of Attainder. This was a parliamentary decree that simply declared a person guilty of a crime, usually treason, without any need for a trial, for evidence to be presented, or for a confession to be heard. It was a legal shortcut to execution, a tool for monarchs to eliminate those they deemed a threat without the inconvenience of justice. Parliament, terrified into submission by the king, passed the Act of Attainder against Margaret Pole. She was instantly stripped of her titles, her lands, and her dignity. The once great Countess of Salisbury, niece of kings and one of the wealthiest women in England, was now, by an act of Parliament, a destitute, condemned traitor. She was taken to the Tower of London, not as a guest, but as a prisoner sentenced to death. Yet, the final command did not come. The 65-year-old woman, whose only real crime was her royal blood, and her son's defiance, was left to languish. For 2 long agonizing years, she remained imprisoned within those cold stone walls her grandson Henry locked away with her. She was a pawn in the king's cruel game, perhaps held as bait in the vain hope it would lure Cardinal Reginald back into his grasp. While she waited, The king she had once served so loyally, the man she had watched grow from a boy into a monarch, descended ever deeper into a maelstrom of brutal, blood-soaked paranoia. Margaret Pole, the last of the great Plantagenets, was about to discover just how deep that paranoia ran. If you're finding this deep dive into the dark side of power compelling, please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to Chronicles of Old Tales. We believe that understanding these harrowing true stories is essential to understanding history, and your support helps us bring more of them to light. Now prepare yourself for the final, horrific chapter of Margaret's life. On the cold, gray morning of May 27, 1541, the heavy door to Margaret Pole's cell creaked open. The now 67-year-old prisoner, frail from 2 years of confinement, was given the news that would have frozen the blood of any soul. She was to die within the hour. Historical accounts suggest she was utterly stunned, completely blindsided by the sudden order. She stood her ground, her voice ringing with the defiance of her royal ancestry, insisting that no crime had ever been proven against her, that she was innocent of treason. But in Henry VIII's England, innocence was a meaningless concept. There would be no trial, no appeal, and no mercy. Because of her noble blood, her execution was to be a private affair, shielded from the gawking eyes of the London mob. It was to take place within the secure walls of the Tower itself, on a small green before a select crowd of about 150 officials and dignitaries. A low wooden block, crude and dark, was set up for the grim task. The air was thick with a dreadful anticipation. What happened next is not just history, it is the stuff of nightmares. It is one of the most gruesome and shameful scenes ever recorded in the annals of England. The regular professional executioner of the Tower was away on business in the north. In his place, a substitute was found, a man described by horrified eyewitnesses as a wretched and blundering youth, a boy who had no experience, no skill, and no idea what he was doing. As she was led to the block, the frail but unbowed Countess refused to submit to the fate of a traitor. She would not lay her head down. A poem, reportedly found carved into the wall of her cell, echoes her final stand: "For traitors on the block should die, I am no traitor, no, not I. My faithfulness stands fast, and so, towards the block I shall not go." Some sources claim she looked a terrified young executioner in the eye and told him that if he wanted her head, he would have to take it as best he could. The result was a catastrophic failure of nerve and skill. The inexperienced axeman, flustered and panicked, swung his heavy weapon. He missed her neck completely. The blade sank deep into her shoulder, a sickening, brutal blow that would have sent shockwaves of agony through her body. But the horror had only just begun. One of the most shocking and visceral accounts claims that after this first agonizing wound, Margaret, fueled by a primal surge of pain and adrenaline, scrambled up from the block and tried to run. What was meant to be a solemn, state-sanctioned execution devolved into a bloody, desperate pursuit. The youth chased the wounded, elderly woman, hacking at her with his axe as she fled. He struck her again and again on her back, her shoulders, her head. It was no longer an execution, it was a frenzied butchering. The witnesses, hardened men accustomed to the sight of death, could only watch in stunned revulsion. It reportedly took a horrifying 11 blows to finally kill her. The panicked and incompetent executioner literally hacked the dignified, royal Countess of Salisbury to pieces. She was mutilated beyond recognition in a spectacle of gore that shocked even a kingdom numbed by the king's tyranny. The final image was not of justice, but of a savage, pitiful massacre. The story of Margaret Pole is more than just a historical account, it's a chilling, visceral reminder of the human cost of absolute, unchecked power. It shows how justice can be perverted, and how human life can become disposable in the hands of a paranoid tyrant. If you believe these explorations into the darker, often ignored corners of history are important, Please show your support by liking this video, subscribing to Chronicles of Old Tales, and hitting the notification bell so you never miss these vital stories that are too often left in the footnotes. Margaret's mutilated body was gathered from the blood-soaked ground and buried without ceremony or honor in the Tower's own chapel, St. Peter and Vengeful St. Peter in chains. It was a final, ignominious resting place she would share with so many of Henry VIII's other victims, including two of his own queens, Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard. When the news of his mother's savage and degrading end reached Cardinal Reginald Pole in Rome, he was not broken. Instead, his grief was forged into a profound declaration of faith. He reportedly announced, "I am now the son of a martyr." He was right. The execution, intended as a private act of revenge, sent shockwaves of revulsion across the courts of Europe. It was universally seen not as justice, but as a monstrous and cowardly act of vengeance against a defenseless, elderly woman. Her real crime was never treason. It was the inconvenient royalty of her Plantagenet blood and the unforgivable defiance of her devoted son. Her horrific death became a powerful and enduring symbol of the sheer brutality of Henry VIII's religious reforms and the depths of his personal tyranny. Margaret's legacy, however, would outlast the Tudors. She had been condemned as a traitor, but in the eyes of the Catholic Church, her steadfastness was that of a saint. In 1886, more than 3 centuries after she was butchered on the scaffold, Pope Leo XIII officially beatified her, along with other English martyrs who had died for their faith. Today, the Catholic Church knows her not as a traitor, but as Blessed Margaret Pole, a martyr who chose death over compromising her conscience. She is remembered not for the treason she was falsely accused of, but for the profound, cruel, and unforgettable injustice of her end. The execution of Margaret Pole remains a uniquely dark and disturbing chapter in the long and often bloody history of England. She was the ultimate survivor woman born on the losing side of a dynastic war, who navigated decades of peril to build a life of honor, wealth, and influence, only to have a paranoid king, her own cousin, tear it all away in a fit of vengeful fury. Her story is a terrifying, intimate illustration of how utterly vulnerable everyone, even the highest born, was to the winds of the crown. She was the last of the Plantagenets, and her royal blood, which had once held the promise of a throne, ultimately did nothing more than seal her fate on a bloody scaffold in the Tower of London. Her horrific death serves as a brutal epitaph for an entire royal dynasty. But more than that, it is a solemn and eternal reminder that behind the grand impersonal tapestry of history, behind the dates and the battles and the acts of Parliament, lie individual stories of immense suffering, unimaginable terror, and in the face of it all, an even greater and more enduring courage.